My father looked at me and said, "Riley, you need to stop acting like you're better than us." And I thought about telling him I'd been paying the mortgage on this house for 6 years. But instead, I just said, "Okay." Dad and I walked out, and I haven't been back since. And 3 weeks ago, the bank threatened foreclosure, and he finally called asking for help. Hi, Jais, and welcome back to my Chanel buddy. Please like this video and subscribe. This Chanel, my name is Riley Brennan, and I am 38 years old. And 4 months ago, I sat across from my father at his kitchen table, and he said, "Riley, you need to stop acting like you're better than us." And I looked at him and I said, "I've never said I was better than you." And he said, "You don't have to say it. We can all see it." And I said, "See what?" And he said, "The way you dress, the way you talk about your job, the way you look at this house like it's beneath you." And I sat there for a long moment and I thought about telling him the truth. I thought about saying, "Dad, I've been paying the mortgage on this house for 6 years and I've never once made you feel small about it," but instead I just said, "Okay." Dad and I stood up and I walked out, and I haven't been back since. And 3 weeks ago, he called me and said, "The bank is threatening foreclosure, and I need your help." And I said, "I can't help." And he said, "What do you mean you can't?" And I said, "I mean, I stopped paying your mortgage 4 months ago the day you told me." I acted like I was better than you, and he went silent, and I said, "I gave you nothing new." Dad, I gave you exactly what you gave me. I made you feel what it's like when family stops showing up, and I hung up. Let me take you back, because this didn't start with a mortgage payment. This started with a father who spent my entire adult life making me feel ashamed for becoming someone he didn't recognize and punishing me for succeeding in ways he never did. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood outside of Pittsburgh, and my father worked in a steel mill for 30 years. And my mother worked part-time at a grocery store, and we didn't have much, but we had enough, and my father was proud of what he did and proud of the life he built, and he made sure everyone knew that his hands built things and his work mattered, and I never questioned that I believed him. When I told my father I wanted to go to college, he said, "What for?" And I said, "Because I want to do something different," and he said, "Different from what?" And I said, "Different from here." And he looked at me like I had insulted him and said, "There's nothing wrong with here, Riley," and I said, "I didn't say there was. I just want to see what else is out there." And he said, "People who leave don't usually come back." And I said, "I'm not leaving, I'm going to school." And he said, "We'll see." I went to the University of Pittsburgh on a partial scholarship, and I worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and I studied business administration because I liked the idea of understanding how things worked at a level beyond just doing the work. And when I came home for Thanksgiving, my father asked how school was, and I said, "It's good. I'm learning a lot." And he said, "Learning what?" And I started to explain a project I was working on, and he cut me off and said, "Riley, don't talk like that here." And I said, "Talk like what?" And he said, "Like you're smarter than everyone else." And I said, "I wasn't trying to." And he said, "Well, that's how it sounds." And I stopped talking. That was the first time, and it wasn't the last. Every time I came home and mentioned something I was working on, or a class I was taking, or an internship, my father found a way to make it sound like I was showing off. And if I tried to downplay it, he'd say, "See? You think you're too good for this." And if I didn't mention it at all, he'd say, "You never tell us anything anymore. You think we wouldn't understand," and I couldn't win. So I stopped trying, and I just came home less and less. I graduated and I got a job at a marketing firm in Philadelphia, and I moved into a small apartment, and I started building a career, and I was good at it, and I got promoted twice in 3 years, and my salary went from $42,000 to $68,000, and I didn't tell my father any of that because I knew what he'd say. When I was 28, my mother called me and said, "Your father's hours got cut at the mill, and we're struggling with the mortgage." And I said, "How much do you need?" And she said, "We're 3 months behind, and we owe $4,800, and I sent the money that same week, and my mother said, "Thank you," and I said, "Of course," and she said, "Don't tell your father you helped. He won't take it well," and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because he doesn't want to feel like he needs you," and I said, "But he does need me," and she said, "I know, but he won't admit it," and I said, "Okay." 6 months later, my mother called again and said, "We're behind again." And this time, I didn't just send a check. I called the mortgage company, and I set up an automatic payment from my account to theirs, and I paid their mortgage every single month for 6 years, and I never told my father, and my mother knew, but we didn't talk about it. And he kept making comments every time I visited about how I thought I was too important to spend time with them, and how I had gotten too fancy for my own good, and I absorbed it because I thought if he knew the truth, he'd feel humiliated. And I didn't want to humiliate him, I wanted to help him. But helping someone who resents you for being able to help is like pouring water into a cup with a hole in it. And I didn't realize that until the day he looked me in the eye and told me I acted like I was better than them while sitting in a house I was paying for, and I realized he wasn't going to stop punishing me for succeeding, and I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for it. The visit that ended everything happened on a Saturday in June, and I had driven 3 hours from Philadelphia to have lunch with my parents, and I walked in wearing a blazer because I had come from a work event that morning, and my father looked at me and said, "Did you come here straight from a board meeting?" And I said, "No. Dad, I had a client breakfast," and he said, "Well, excuse us for not being fancy enough." And I said, "I didn't say that." And he said, "You don't have to. Riley, we can all see the way you look at this place." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "You walk in here like you're visiting a museum. Like this is some relic of a life? You're glad you escaped." And I said, "Dad, I drove 3 hours to be here." And he said, "Yeah. And you'll leave in 2 and go back to your perfect life and forget we exist." And I said, "That's not true." And he said, "Then why don't you ever stay? Why don't you ever act like you actually want to be here?" And I said, "Because every time I come here, you make me feel like I've done something wrong just by existing." And he said, "There it is." And I said, "There. What is?" And he said, "You acting like you're better than us." And I stood up and I said, "I have never once said I was better than you." And he said, "You don't have to say it. Riley, it's in everything you do." And I looked at my mother and she was staring at her plate, and I looked back at my father and I said, "Okay, Dad," and I left. I drove home and I sat in my apartment and I thought about all the years I had been paying for a house where I wasn't welcome, and I thought about all the times my father had made me feel small for being capable. And I opened my banking app and I canceled the automatic mortgage payment, and I didn't tell anyone, I just stopped. For the first 2 months, nothing happened, and then my mother called and said, "Riley, the mortgage payment didn't go through and the bank is calling," and I said, "I know," and she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I stopped paying it." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm tired of funding a home where I'm treated like a visitor." And she said, "Riley, your father didn't mean it." And I said, "Mom, he's been saying it for 10 years. And she said, "He's proud. He doesn't know how to handle the fact that you're doing better than he did." And I said, "That's not my fault." And she said, "I know. But can't you just let it go?" And I said, "I have been letting it go for a decade and it hasn't changed anything. So now I'm letting it stop." And she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means I'm not paying anymore," and she hung up. My father didn't call me for another 6 weeks. And when he finally did, his voice was different. It was smaller. And he said, "Riley, we got a foreclosure notice." And I said, "I know." And he said, "You know?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why didn't you tell us you were paying the mortgage?" And I said, "Because Mom asked me not to." And he said, "How long?" And I said, 6 years, and he went quiet. And then he said, "Why did you stop?" And I said, "Because you told me I acted like I was better than you." And I decided, if that's what you think, then you don't need my help. And he said, "That's not fair." And I said, "Fair would have been you, noticing that every time I visited, you made me feel unwelcome. And still, I kept showing up, and still I kept helping. And you never once said thank you. You just kept accusing me of looking down on you." And he said, "I didn't know." And I said, "You didn't ask." He said, "Riley, we're going to lose the house." And I said, "Then you're going to lose the house." And he said, "You'd really let that happen?" And I said, "Dad, you spent 10 years making me feel like I wasn't good enough to be in that house. So yes, I'm going to let you lose it." And he said, "I never said you weren't good enough." And I said, "You said I acted like I was better than you, which means you thought I thought you weren't good enough. And that's the same thing." And he didn't have an answer. My mother called me crying 2 days later and said, "Riley, please don't do this. Your father is a proud man." And I said, "I know. And that pride has cost him everything." And she said, "He's sorry." And I said, "He didn't say that." And she said, "He doesn't know how." And I said, "Then he can figure it out." And she said, "You're punishing him?" And I said, "No, Mom, I'm giving him exactly what he gave me. He made me feel like I didn't belong. So I stopped coming. He made me feel ashamed of success. So I stopped sharing. He made me feel unwelcome, so I stopped paying for the privilege of being rejected." And she said, "That's cruel." And I said, "It's a mirror." They refinanced the house, and my mother went back to work full-time. And my father picked up a part-time job, and they're making it work barely. And my father sent me one email 4 months after I stopped paying, and it said, "I didn't understand what you were doing for us, and I'm sorry I made you feel like it didn't matter." And I read it and I didn't respond, because understanding what someone does for you after you've lost it is not the same as valuing it while you have it. And I wasn't interested in teaching him gratitude through loss. I was interested in protecting myself from someone who punished me for caring. I haven't been back to that house, and I don't plan to go back. And my mother asks me every few months if I'll reconsider. And I tell her the same thing every time I didn't create the distance Dad did. I just stopped pretending it wasn't there. And if he wants to repair it, he knows where I am, but I'm not going to keep showing up to a place where my presence is treated like an insult. If you have ever been made to feel ashamed for outgrowing the place you came from, if you have ever been accused of thinking you're better just because you wanted different or achieved more, I need you to hear this. Their discomfort with your growth is not your responsibility, and you are not required to shrink so they can feel big. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop participating in your own diminishment and let people experience what life looks like without you holding it together. And if that feels like punishment to them, that's not because you're cruel. It's because they never noticed you were the foundation. And now they're learning what it's like to stand on their own.